My name is Jake Sika, and I'm 31 years old. The moment that changed my life forever started on what seemed like a completely ordinary morning. I was sitting alone at the kitchen table, holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. The house was quiet, and for a few brief minutes, everything felt normal. Then my mother walked in. She didn't knock. But honestly, that wasn't surprising. In that house, knocking was never a habit. Privacy didn't exist. Personal space wasn't respected. It didn't matter whether it was your bedroom, your thoughts, or your feelings. Nothing truly belonged to you. Without saying a word, she pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. Every movement was slow and controlled, as if she had carefully planned this conversation long before entering the room. She placed her hands together on the table and looked at me with the same expression someone might wear before discussing a business deal. That's when she said something I never expected to hear. "Your brother is moving in with his 2 kids." She paused, "Which means you need to leave." For a second, I thought I had heard her wrong. Then she added another sentence that hit even harder. "You're a parasite, Isabel. You always have been." I froze. The coffee sat untouched in front of me. The refrigerator hummed quietly in the background. Every little sound in that kitchen suddenly felt louder than normal. Everything except the one thing I desperately wanted to hear. Some sign that she was joking. "You're joking, right?" I asked. But deep down, I already knew the answer. My mother never joked when it came to her own comfort. And she certainly never joked when it involved making life easier for my brother. A short laugh escaped her lips, not a warm laugh, not an embarrassed one, just a cold, dismissive sound that made it clear she had already made her decision. "No," she replied. "I'm serious. You have a week." A week. That was all. No discussion, no explanation, no concern about where I would go. Just 7 days to disappear. I didn't argue, I didn't beg, I didn't even respond. Instead, I quietly stood up from the table, left the cold coffee behind, and walked to my room. Once inside, I reached into the closet, pulled down a suitcase from the top shelf, and placed it on the bed. Then I started packing one shirt, one pair of jeans, one item after another. My hands moved automatically while my mind struggled to process what had just happened. Sometimes shock is so overwhelming that your body takes over before your emotions can catch up. I didn't cry, not then, and I didn't fight back. The truth was, I had stopped arguing with my mother years ago, around the time I turned 24. That was when I finally realized that no matter what I said, she would never hear me. But as I folded my clothes into that suitcase, one question kept repeating in my head: why now? And what was about to happen next would reveal a truth far bigger than being asked to leave the house. By the time I turned 24, I had learned something painful. Even when I managed to win an argument, I still walked away feeling like I had lost a piece of myself. After a while, I stopped trying. I finished packing, closed the suitcase, and headed for the front door. As I passed through the living room, my father sat in front of the television. He never looked up, not once. That silence told me everything I needed to know. But there was one thing neither of my parents knew. In fact, it was something they had never cared enough to find out. The house my mother had just thrown me out of, the same house where she called me a parasite only minutes earlier, didn't belong to them. It belonged to me. Every wall, every room, every brick, every inch of that property was legally in my name. And it had been that way for 3 years. Before I tell you what happened next, you need to understand how things reached this point. Because the way my mother treated me that morning didn't come out of nowhere. It had been building for years. I grew up as the child nobody noticed. In our family, everything revolved around my older brother. Callum was 5 years older than me. He was outgoing, confident, and knew exactly how to charm people. Most adults loved him immediately because they never stayed around long enough to see beyond the surface. From a very young age, I understood something that hurt more with every passing year. I was never the favorite. When it came time for college, my parents paid every cent of Callum's education. For me, nothing, not a single contribution. I worked 2 jobs while attending university. I took out loans. I pushed myself through every semester and eventually earned a degree in finance. But along with that degree came something else, a determination fueled by years of being treated as though I mattered less than someone else in my own family. After graduating, I moved back home. At least, that was supposed to be the plan temporarily. I told myself I would stay only long enough to save money and find an apartment. A few months became a year became 2, then 3. And during that time, something changed. My parents stopped seeing me as a person and started treating me like part of the furniture. Always there, always useful, never appreciated. I contributed rent every month, no acknowledgement. I bought groceries, no thanks. I handled repairs around the house, silence. When my father's pension wasn't enough to cover expenses, I quietly paid bills. 1 year, I even covered the property taxes when they couldn't afford them. Yet none of those things seemed to count, at least not in the invisible scorecard my mother kept in her head. The only thing that mattered was Callum had gone through a divorce. Callum had 2 children. Callum needed room. And because Callum needed something, apparently I had to disappear. But there was one detail my mother knew absolutely nothing about. A detail that would soon change everything. About 2 years before that morning, my father came to me privately. It was one of the few times in my life I had ever seen him vulnerable. He looked exhausted, embarrassed, defeated. That was when he confessed the truth. The house was in serious trouble. Years earlier, he had taken out a second mortgage. The debt had spiraled out of control. Pavements had fallen behind, and the bank was moving closer and closer to foreclosure. He was ashamed. More importantly, he didn't want my mother finding out how bad things had become. Then he asked me a question: was there anything I could do? By then, I had been working in finance for 6 years, and unlike him, I understood exactly how serious the situation was. I negotiated directly with the bank. I restructured the debt. Then I used savings I had spent years building through discipline and sacrifice to pay off the remaining balance completely. In return, my father agreed to transfer ownership of the house to me. The process wasn't complicated. Everything was done legally. Every document was properly signed. Every record was filed. The title changed hands. My father's name came off, mine went on. And from that day forward, the property legally belonged to me. The shocking part? My mother never questioned it. Not once. She never asked to see the deed. She never checked ownership records. It never crossed her mind that someone else's name could be on the property. After all, she had spent more than 30 years believing everything around her automatically belonged to her. That belief was about to collide with reality, and the impact would be impossible to ignore. Then came the phone call. At exactly 5 a.m. the following morning, my phone started ringing. Over and over again, it was my father. I ignored the first few calls. Then more came. By the 7th call, in just 4 minutes, I was already awake, lying on a narrow bed in a budget hotel located only 2 miles from the house. I stared at a dark water stain spreading across the ceiling while my phone continued vibrating beside me. When the 8th call came through, I finally answered. The moment I picked up, my father didn't waste a second. His voice was strained, panicked, almost breathless. "Isabel, your mother found the deed." The voice I heard from my father that morning was nothing like the one I had heard the previous night. Just hours earlier, he had been sitting in front of the television, silent and detached, acting as though none of it concerned him. He looked like a man who had spent years letting other people make the emotional decisions for him. But now he sounded terrified. His words stumbled over each other. "Your mother was searching for the insurance paperwork," he said. "She opened the filing cabinet and found the property documents. Isabel, she doesn't understand. She keeps saying there has to be a mistake. She says your name shouldn't be on those papers." I listened without interrupting. When he finally stopped talking, I answered calmly, "It's not a mistake, Dad, and you know it's not." The silence that followed stretched on for so long that I glanced at my phone to make sure the call was still connected. It was 20 minutes later, my mother called. If my father sounded nervous, my mother sounded explosive. The shock had worn off. Now she was angry, and anger had always been her favorite place to hide whenever reality refused to cooperate with her expectations. She insisted there had been an error. She accused me of taking advantage of my father during a difficult time. Then, incredibly, she called me a parasite again. Given the situation, I found that almost unbelievable. Still, I didn't interrupt. For 31 years, I had watched my mother's outbursts follow the same pattern. First came the anger, then the accusations, and eventually, if you waited long enough, the first signs of doubt would appear. So I waited badly, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one without options. Finally, she paused long enough to take a breath. That was when I spoke. "The house belongs to me, Mom." Silence. "It has belonged to me for 2 years." More silence. "Dad came to me because the bank was getting ready to take the house. You were only months away from losing it," I continued before she could interrupt. "I paid off the debt. The title is in my name. I have every document. Nothing about this is a mistake, and there's nothing to argue about." The silence that followed felt even heavier, and then something happened that I couldn't remember ever witnessing before. My mother had no response, not one. For the first time, she was completely out of words. What happened during the next 72 hours was something I had imagined many times but never truly expected to see. The phone call started almost immediately. My mother called my aunt. My aunt called my father's brother. Then relatives began calling me one after another. Each conversation sounded slightly different, but the message was always the same. Family property is complicated. Maybe you should be flexible. Maybe there's another solution. Maybe you should reconsider. I listened to every one of them. Then I calmly explained the facts. The house had been only 2 months away from foreclosure. My parents had kept that secret from everyone. I stepped in with my own money. Everything was legal. Everything was documented. There was a signed agreement. There was nothing to negotiate because there had been no wrongdoing. On the second day, Callum finally called. That conversation was different. Unlike everyone else, Callum believed his charm could solve almost any problem. It usually had. He started carefully. He said he understood why I was upset. He admitted Mom had crossed a line. He even agreed that calling me a parasite was unacceptable. I told him I agreed. Then came the real reason for the call. Slowly, he shifted the conversation toward his situation, his divorce, his children, his need for stability. And eventually, he arrived exactly where I knew he would. He suggested that maybe everyone could simply stay in the house while I found another place to live. After all, according to him, I was a single woman with a strong income and far more flexibility than a divorced father raising 2 children. I let him finish. Then I asked one question. Callum, are you asking me to move out of my own house so that you can move in? The line went quiet. I just want you to hear yourself say it. For once, Callum didn't have an answer, and that's when I realized something important. No one in my family had ever been forced to listen to their own logic all the way through. On the 4th day, I returned to the house, not for an argument, not to make a scene. I went back because it was my home, and I was done acting like it wasn't. My mother was standing in the kitchen when I walked in. The difference was obvious. Only 3 days earlier, she had seemed untouchable. Now she looked smaller, not physically, emotionally. Sometimes people shrink when the beliefs they've relied on for decades suddenly collapse. My father sat quietly at the table. Neither of them spoke. So I did. I told them I wasn't there to throw them out. I explained that I had no intention of treating them the way I had been treated. I told them that cruelty ends with the person who refuses to pass it forward. Then I made something very clear. Callum could visit. He could spend time with his children, but he would not be moving into the house. That decision belonged to me now, not to him, not to my mother, not to anyone else. My mother's eyes filled with tears. Over the years, I had seen her cry many times. Usually, those tears appeared when she wanted sympathy or wanted to shift responsibility. But this time felt different. This wasn't strategy. This was reality finally catching up. For the first time, she was facing a truth she couldn't talk her way around. The child she had ignored, the child she had underestimated, the child she had called a parasite. That child now held the future of the home she lived in. You might think I felt victorious. I didn't. If I'm honest, I felt exhausted. I felt sad. Years of hurt don't disappear the moment you're proven right. But beneath all of that was another feeling, a stronger one, a quieter one. For a moment, I struggled to identify it. Then I understood. It was certainty. It was stability. It was the feeling of finally standing somewhere that no one could take away from me. Before moving forward, I gave my parents 2 conditions. The first was simple. The word parasite would never again be used in my presence, not as a joke, not in anger, not ever. The second condition mattered even more. I wanted acknowledgement, not money, not repayment. I wanted both of them to openly recognize every contribution I had made to that household through the years. The bills, the taxes, the repairs, the sacrifices, everything. My father agreed immediately. My mother needed 3 days, but eventually she did it too. A few weeks later, Callum found a rental apartment of his own. Life slowly settled. As for me, I made one small change. I repainted the hallway a color my mother had rejected for years, and every morning, when I make coffee in that kitchen, I sit at the same table where everything changed. Sometimes I let the coffee grow cold while I think about how close I came to walking away from something that was already mine. And every time I'm reminded of a lesson that took 31 years to learn. The people who underestimate you the most are often the least prepared for the moment you finally stop accepting it. If this story kept you hooked until the end, make sure to subscribe now. Every week, we share powerful stories about ordinary people who stayed calm, stood their ground, and changed their lives without wasting a single unnecessary word. And trust me, the next story is even more unbelievable.